I think from that perspective, like, again, putting yourself in the customer's shoes actually enlightens you to think about, well, what are the other pieces of technology that my customer has to touch before they ever get to my product? And those are the pieces of technology that typically you want to think about partnering with. So with Stripe, it was like the e-commerce storefronts, it was the invoicing software, it was the accounting software after the money came through. All of those pieces of software made us think, well, either we're going to have to build an e-commerce storefront ourselves, which was more than we wanted to do, or we could partner with Shopify and partner with BigCommerce and partner with these companies.
Welcome to Generation Builders podcast, brought to you by Software. I'm your host, Mariam. The goal of the show is to unpack and share the superpowers and lessons of today's most successful software companies and discuss how the next generation will use and build software without code. I interview world-class product, growth, and community experts who help build some of the best companies of today. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the podcast, Cristina. It's so exciting to have you here. Today's conversation is with Cristina Cordova, a partner in First Route Capital and the next head of platform and partnerships from Notion and Stripe. She was one of their early hires, in fact, the early partnerships hire, and helped establish and grow partnerships with companies like Shopify, Squarespace, and Apple. We will dive into all things partnerships within the product-led growth context, and how can partnerships really accelerate your company's growth, or maybe not. We'll learn about that in a bit. But Cristina, welcome on board. And do you mind starting by sharing a bit about your background and how it all started for you and how your journey evolved and took you where you are today?
Sure. Yeah. Well, really great to be here. Thank you so much for having me. A little bit of context on my background. I started out as the very first employee at a startup called Pulse back in 2010. And that was my very first kind of, full-time job and also my first startup experience. So I think I was very lucky to be, employee number one so early, and just be very hands-on and doing, basically a little bit of everything, in getting that company off of the ground. And after I was doing like marketing and community and partnerships, I really kind of carved out a specialty for myself in partnerships, and ended up doing that for the vast majority of my time there, specifically around content and distribution partnerships. And then I happened to meet the founders of Stripe, coincidentally, who were living in the house next to the Pulse office at the time. And I thought they were extremely talented, got to know them over the course of many months, and joined Stripe as the first partnerships hire and around the 28th employee overall. And at that time, maybe we had some kind of product market fit within this like developer community, but we didn't necessarily have a product market fit like overall, in terms of people who create and start businesses, which is, generally the market we wanted to be in longer term. So I worked on distribution partnerships there to help grow us to kind of these like non-technical users. So anyone who wants to build like a Shopify store or send an invoice via Xero or FreshBooks, we acquired a significant number of users through those distribution partnerships. And then I also worked on a bunch of product partnerships with probably every big company in tech, Apple, Facebook, Google, et cetera, which was a really great learning experience for me. And then I went on to lead a business unit, building new financial services products for businesses. So we launched Stripe Corporate Card and Stripe Treasury while I was there. And then from there, I moved on to Notion, which I happened to angel invest in when the company was around, I don't know, maybe 15 or so people. And I thought the team was really talented, obviously, which is why I put my money behind it. But then I decided to, I guess, double down on that investment with my time, and joined the company full-time around 40 employees. So I joined and I led our platform product efforts and our partnerships efforts. So, we were thinking about launching our very first API and building a community of developers around Notion, beyond the kind of community of tool makers that were already using Notion at that point. And then in the last 6 months that I was there, I also led growth for the company as well. So thinking about finally building out a product and engineering team around growth, and being, kind of more methodical with how we wanted to grow the self-serve business primarily. So that was a really great experience for me. But after that, I was, starting to think about kind of what I wanted to do next. I knew I wanted it to be different than just like joining another early stage startup again and trying to, do it all over. So I started really ramping up my angel investments over time, and then ended up joining First Round Capital in February to effectively make that a practice. So yeah, I'm working on both, investing in companies that are coming to us and looking for funding, and then also looking at companies that we could potentially, start from within, and try to match really great talent with fantastic ideas that we've vetted. So doing a little bit of both of those things, which kind of brings me back into startup land, which is nice.
Yeah, it sounds like you found the right place to also be an operator to an extent, right?
Yeah, exactly.
At
Yes, yeah. So I spend most of my time with companies in B2B SaaS, developer tools, and fintech. I like to spend time in places that I know well, because I think that's where I can be most helpful to founders ultimately.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. That really sounds exciting. And so you worked in those two companies, especially the last, the Notion and Stripe, some of the most successful tech companies of today. So could you probably describe what are some of the 3 common characteristics or superpowers that you believe made those companies successful?
Mm-hmm. So one, I would say, to me, is an opinionated view of product. I think it's extremely difficult to build really great businesses without having people with strong opinions about how they should be built. And I think if you looked at the first 10 engineers at Stripe, I think you would say that those people were people who had very strong opinions about how they wanted to experience developer tools. And in the same way, we're willing to debate those topics, right? So, I have this very strong opinion, somebody else has this strong opinion. Well, let's debate it out and see, who we think is right as an organization. And I think having a company where you both have people with strong opinions, but people who are willing to, kind of disagree and commit after some strong debate, is a great place to be, because you're not just like blindly following whoever you think, has the right product thesis. So that was one thing I think was pretty consistent between both companies. Second, I would say community. So I think this is particularly true of Notion in terms of turning people who were using the product into people who could spread awareness around the product, and do so for free. We have this entire Notion Ambassadors program specifically for people who could try out early versions of betas that we were testing, give us feedback, share a lot of that feedback into the world, with YouTube videos, with TikTok videos, I had really never seen anything like that community. And I think Stripe had something very similar, but much more targeted at like a developer community and, people spreading word of mouth through communities like Hacker News and, kind of more targeted developer communities than I think you see a little bit more widespread and open with Notion. And then lastly, I would say like a focus on the user. And, that's, I think in Stripe's case, it was part of our values. Users first was one of our values for a very long period of time. With the idea being that like, if you are building a product and it doesn't necessarily drive value for the customer, but maybe it's good for you strategically as a business, then you've built the wrong product. And it was something that I really appreciated, that like often even within Stripe, you could win debates purely based off of like, if you talk to more users and if those users were opinionated about what you were asking them. And to me, that was really, as someone who loves talking to customers, that was something that was, you know, really, really great. And of course, in joining Notion, like it was like the second I joined, like user feedback just flooded to me from every friend, acquaintance, etc. And in the early days of Notion, we had this really fantastic like tagging system of like every single piece of feedback that would come in would get tagged in a Notion database. And we would actively track like what were the areas of our products that were, you know, getting the most amount of feedback that we really need to spend more time on over time. So yeah, I mean, I think we had a very similar ethos there. And I think, you know, most strong companies believe that they should listen to customers.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And also, I guess also it's the same with many other successful companies of the world, right? They also have been very customer centric, listening to their community, and very product focused, which I think is the right way to win the customer's heart and really bringing value to them. So you joined as a first partnership hire in Stripe, and I'm curious, how do you think of partnerships in the product-led growth context? How much you think partnership really influences the growth of the company, and can you consider it even as one of the main growth levers?
Yeah. So I joined Stripe and we had no sales motion, right? We had people doing support. So like if you asked a question, we would respond to you. But if you wanted to like send us an RFP, if you wanted to send us questions about the product for sales purposes, like there wasn't really, you know, a whole lot there outside of like factually answering your questions. And so about a couple months after I joined, we hired our very first salesperson. And I think a lot of that was just like reactive, right? Just like responding to the inbound from a sales perspective. And there was not a whole lot of outbound there. So the great thing was that we had a lot of inbound. And I think that, you know, that's a true tell of a product-led growth business, that like people are coming to you and you don't necessarily have to do a significant amount of work to market to them. And I think for us, when we were thinking about expanding the ideal customer profile. So the early ideal customer profile was very much this like developer who was working on a startup, a side project, those kinds of things. You know, typically a smaller, fast growing type of business, not someone making a huge purchase decision.
No. And most of them would fail as well at one point, right?
Exactly. And then you realize most of these businesses fail. And then sometimes that developer goes on to another big company. They take a job somewhere, and then they're like, oh, I used this Stripe thing at my last startup. Like, why don't we use that here? And again, like the word of mouth, the ability to like have a really good product experience that actually extends through a person working on a side project to a person in their real life and their real job, I think was really critical for us. But I think from a partnerships perspective, once we were trying to go after like these non-technical businesses, someone who would like never write code at all in their lifetime, you had to start thinking differently about how you were going to get distribution to that customer. And so I think we thought about it in the context of like, where does one start a business if you're thinking about getting started? So I like literally put myself in the shoes of someone who was thinking about starting like Sally's t-shirt shop, was like my case example of like, I just want to build a t-shirt shop. Like, how would I go about doing that? Okay, I will, you know, Google search for like e-commerce storefront or something like that. And I'll see what comes back, and maybe I'll sign up for one of these. And then as I'm setting up my store, how do I think about payments? Is it something that's like separate? Is it something that's like, you know, combined and ingrained in that experience? What is it like? And then how could we build a product experience that inserted us into that flow of starting an online business? And so, you know, I thought about that in terms of many different customer profiles. Oh, I'm Cristina, the consultant, and I need to send my client an invoice. How do I go about setting up my business to, you know, send and receive invoices? And I think from that perspective, like, again, putting yourself in the customer's shoes actually enlightens you to think about, well, what are the other pieces of technology that my customer has to touch before they ever get to my product? And those are the pieces of technology that typically you want to think about partnering with. So with Stripe, it was like the e-commerce storefronts, it was the invoicing software, it was the accounting software after the money came through. All of those pieces of software made us think, well, either we're going to have to build an e-commerce storefront ourselves, which was more than we wanted to do, or we could partner with Shopify and partner with BigCommerce and partner with these companies. And they're really great at serving this non-technical customer. And we're not. Like, we are doing like developer support, not, non-technical user support. So from that perspective, they could provide us distribution and we could build a really great product that is technical and serving, Shopify, the platform, or Xero, the platform. And then the end customer could go directly to them. So for us, it was a really great way to just drive adoption in the days when, we didn't have a lot of adoption. Like, I think when I joined, one of our biggest customers was like the SF MoMA gift shop online, like not a big customer, right? So you're really thinking about how to grow the business and start expanding outward in terms of ideal customer profile. And then if partnerships can help you deliver that. And for us, it's like we didn't have a sales team. So we weren't going to drive distribution through sales. And of course, a lot of like really fantastic companies drive distribution through sales. And Stripe does that now, obviously, very large sales organization operating very efficiently. But at the beginning, there was kind of like, I don't want to say a distaste, but like a weariness of hiring salespeople in a way.
And engineers building Stripe, I can imagine how over they are not bringing sales.
Yeah. Thankfully, I was able to like slide in there as like this kind of business person who wasn't a salesperson, right? And I think that was like more achievable for our stage. And I think if you're a developer-led, like engineering and product-driven company, then you probably have a very different perspective around sales and salespeople and how you're going to grow than if you're an operationally driven business that, it cares about very different types of things. So, so I think that was a big difference for us.
That makes total sense. And I'm curious to also hear your thoughts about, do you think there is specific types of products for which, or companies for which the partnership could work or could not? And Stripe has been one of the kind of the data layers or really low level product to be integrated within some of these other partners that you mentioned, right? So it was more of an API integration. Do you think it does make a difference whether you are more of an API level type of company, or if you are, let's say, a front-end facing application builder, like for example, Salesforce, does that still, is it on the same level, or there is some core differences?
Yeah. So I would say in a lot of ways, what I have found is that deeply embedded partnerships tend to work better. And I find deeply embedded partnerships tend to have like a technical integration component. So sometimes it's a company like Stripe where you have all of these APIs and they're actually public and anyone can take advantage of them. Sometimes you are a company that's actually building APIs just for a discrete set of partners, and those APIs are not public, right? So a lot of companies tend to do both if they want to partner. I find the partnerships that tend to not work so well are these like referral partnerships. And I think it's just like sometimes you can be inserted like at exactly the right point in time, and the partner that's referring business to you as the smaller startup often, like they have a particular use case for your product and that can work. But I find that if there's a technical integration, if the user is like defaulted into your product for some reason, I find those integrations tend to work a lot better and tend to be more scalable than like, okay, you referred a customer to me and now I have to pay a salesperson to close that customer, right? So like less efficient.
Yeah.
So I try to think about it in the context of like, would I have gotten this customer anyway? If not, then this partner is driving a lot of value. And sometimes there are partnerships that you build purely because the product experience is going to be so much better. And so, you know, for example, when we thought about building our first partnerships at Notion, a lot of customers had asked us for, you know, a million different kinds of integrations. And so we could have gone out and like partnered with like, you know, 1,000 different companies and had this like huge motion. But in a lot of ways, it made sense for us to start with like an integration platform. So we partnered with like Zapier at the beginning. And the idea being that, okay, I partner with this company once, and then we unlock thousands of integrations that they have available to them. And so, you know, again, like I like to think about it in the context of like, that's a great experience for our customers. Our customers are demanding it. It's really hard to tie it directly to revenue as you can with like distribution partnerships. But it's a far better customer experience. And if it's a reason that people are choosing your platform over something else, I think it can make a really big difference. I think the biggest area where I see smaller companies fail is when they're trying to partner with a really large company. And the large company just pushes them around, gives them really bad economic terms that they're just willing to accept because, you know, they're small and they don't have negotiating power. And often they end up spending a lot of time like doing a lot of custom work for a partnership that doesn't yield what they think it will yield. And often that's because the customer profiles are so different, right? Like big company and your company don't exactly mesh well in terms of the customer overlap. So I think where you do tend to find a lot of success when you are like maybe doing some custom work for a partnership is where your customer profile and the other partner's customer profile align quite well. So with Stripe, for example, partnering with Shopify worked really well for us in the early days because Shopify was still like a smallish company. I think we were maybe 30 people when that happened. Or less, and they were like 150 people, right? So big in our eyes, but not really that big. But they were growing fast, and they had a lot of the like small, fast-moving businesses that were closer to us than like, let's say, partnering with like a Magento. So older, stodgy technology with like probably stodgier clients that were less probably willing to use Stripe. So I think so figuring out like who's the right customer that you're targeting and ensuring that this partner is actually going to be able to deliver them to you.
Yeah, it's more of making sure that it's actually kind of more of an organic choice that people would have made anyway if they had this integration, more natural integration that is useful to the customer, right? Not forcing them towards using the integration, but just really being there and to help their to get them more value out of the product. So as you mentioned about partnership in terms of integrating on a, let's say, API level, on a really technical level, and then how do you think of something beyond that, right? Partnership is, especially deeper partnership, involves a lot more beyond just really being available as an integration or a touch point for the customer inside the other product, or as a reference point. So what other parts did you take into account when doing partnerships? Was there any marketing related types of activities or co-marketing type or content creation type? So what are some of the other pieces you need to think about as a founder when integrating with other platforms?
Yeah. So one I think a lot about is what I call placement. So the idea being that like, okay, we've partnered together. Fantastic. But like, are you also partnered with a lot of other like competitors of mine? Right.
And how do I distribute my product versus the others?
Yeah. Are you just one of like many partners, right? I think that is less than ideal. And you want to be in a situation where, like, ideally, you're the exclusive partner, if you can wrangle that. If not, you're like the default. So if a customer asks, like, who should I go to for like this service, the partner would, by default, always say this. And And then if not, then like there are some other options if that doesn't work for them. But that was something I think that made a really big difference for Stripe. If we had just said, hey, Shopify, you can partner with like 100 different payment services, great. But we pushed for, being the default for most of their customers, and 99% of customers went with the default solution that was offered to them. So really thinking about like who else is at play in this ecosystem that you're in now, and how can you position yourself favorably, ideally not just because you are a good negotiator, but because you truly do believe that your product is the best for this particular customer base. So being able to articulate that, I think, is ideal.
Yeah.
So that would be one. Two, I would say marketing or co-marketing does really make a difference. I do think it's twofold. One, I think you're trying to market to the partners' customers and making sure that you are like aligned on messaging and that you are clear about like what's going to launch. So with any like partner term sheet that I would put together, there would be a section that's like marketing or co-marketing terms. And so are we in their customer newsletter? Are we on their blog? Are we, do we have placement on their website? Right. And this is both just to make sure that customers are aware of the integration when it launches, but also because we want to track, do these marketing initiatives actually drive any growth from the associated customers? That can tell us a lot for like what we do for future partnerships, or where we want to push for something again, like, oh, including us in this email newsletter seemed to work well. Like, let's try that again in 6 months. And then lastly, I think you want co-marketing often because if you are going to partner with multiple players in the space, I think it can provide a lot of value to you. So as an example, in Stripe's time when we were pushing for this partnership with Shopify, we included our brand as part of like their moniker. So they had like this Shopify payments tag of like, you're signing up for Shopify payments. But we were like, that's great, but like, can you include a powered by Stripe like section under that logo? Right. And like, of course, I think part of it was potentially for the customer to know that like Stripe was behind the scenes doing a lot of this work on payments. But in a lot of ways, it was actually much more beneficial for anyone else who was like, oh, Shopify has this really great payments business. Let me like sign up for their flows and see what it's like. And then if you're at like an invoicing company, if you're at a booking company or something like that, and you're signing up for this flow, you can see that like we're powering that offering. And so we got a lot of partner outreach from people who were like, I see you're partnered with Shopify. We would love to partner with you too. Right. So I think a lot of the co-marketing can actually bring about new and additional kinds of partnerships. Just because, for a lot of these spaces, payments, e-commerce, et cetera, there are a lot of people who kind of watch what other people do closely. And I'm sure that's true for workspace, for collaboration, for website building, a lot of these other spaces. So that would be kind of one other that I would be aware of. And then lastly, I think, in a lot of ways, these partnerships can be best measured by some kind of metric that you and the partner agree on in advance. And I think a failure case of, what could have been a really successful partnership is when you don't set those metrics in advance. And maybe 6 months in, you're like, hey, like we didn't really get what we thought we were going to get from this partnership. And then the partner is like, oh, you didn't? Like, I thought you would be happy with this. And so just kind of misaligned expectations on what would be delivered. So I would definitely push for outlining those metrics of success in advance and then like checking in at certain periods, quarterly, et cetera, to figure out like, are we hitting the metrics and are we doing what we thought we would do? And I think, if you're not aligned on that from the beginning, then it's probably likely that it's not worth your time to do that partnership.
Yeah, and I guess that's also beneficial on both sides, right? The partners as well want to make sure that they are bringing value to you and customers, and then backwards as well,
Right.
that it's beneficial both sides. So what do you think, when is the right time then to bring partnership on board, really? How do you evaluate if partnerships can bring impact to your business? Should you hire a full-time person to drive partnerships, or so do you leave it until there's really a need and you just want to bring someone to help scale
Yeah.
the efforts?
So I would say, and I think this is what Stripe did, which I think ended up working out quite well, was so our COO at the time was the first person kind of signing a lot of these partnership contracts ultimately, and doing the very first, negotiations. And I think we signed like 3 partnership agreements, 4 partnership agreements, and we were launching the product that underpins a lot of these partnerships publicly. And so I think his anticipation was, oh, we're going to launch this publicly, and then we're going to get a bunch of like partner inbound that then I'm going to have to handle. And I have, a job to do, right? Lots of other things to be working on. So at the time, I thought about it in the context of, well, are there things that like I could add value to, and like as someone who's thinking about joining? And it was obvious that there was this like one area of partnership that was already going, right? He had already signed a few contracts. They're launching this product in a few months to the rest of the world. Like that's clearly an area where like, that could be my entire job. Of course, I think as a partnerships person, I didn't want it to be like all of my job, like just working on this like one type of deal. So I spent a lot of time with them to think about like, okay, like, sure, this is what I would do for maybe the first 2 years or something. But like, if we're successful and this is a great business, like, what do you think partnerships might be like in 4 years from now? Right. We had no idea that we were going to be like, that Apple would want to come talk to us about helping them launch Apple Pay. Right. Like, so it's hard to anticipate things that like literally don't yet exist. Right. But just having a real sense of like what it could be and the different areas of potential partnerships, even though you think those are like a little far off for like where you are as a business. So for me, I really thought about it in the context of, like, is there an opportunity that is like clear and I can get to work on this today? Great. I should join. Right. And then is there something that like is exciting for the longer term? Right. And I think like any company should think about it very similarly, when they think about hiring someone for this role. Like, are you thinking about like very soon being overwhelmed with the amount of partnerships work, like as a founder or as an early stage exec, then it probably makes sense to like hire a person for it. Where I find you can go wrong is where like as a company, you might see competitors of yours like doing partnerships or something like that. Or, you are like, like, I feel like we should be working with more companies in our space or something like that. Let's just like hire a person to like go have those conversations. Right. But there are no clear metrics of success for how this person is going to succeed. And they can spin up just like a lot of time talking to other companies, not necessarily seeing any success, not necessarily being able to deliver anything with the internal like product and engineering org, which, if you have some great partnership ideas, but then they require you to build some APIs and there's no appetite internally for spending time on that, then you probably have a mismatch, right? So I think having conversations around like, what are the most likely kinds of partnerships, and like, what would the bar be for you to dedicate engineering and product resources to execute on those partnerships, and like making sure you're aligned with whoever you would hire, would make sense. But I would say like, there are not a lot of companies that have had a ton of success with partnerships. And so often I would say it's like a later hire. Of course, for me personally, I've always joined companies really early, but I've also like thought about the decision in the context of like, is there a lot of potential partnerships work here? And is this a company that is uniquely positioned? Notion building out its own platform and set of APIs where I was doing both partnerships and product work. Or in the case of Stripe, launching a new product that was very partnerships oriented. So they already put resources towards this effort. And knowing that it was a company that wanted to use partnerships to expand its ideal customer profile. I think that for me was like the sign that this was an area that the company wanted to invest in, and that it was a company that was uniquely suited to be able to launch and scale partnerships. And a lot of companies just don't have that. And if you hire someone to just like go have conversations, you'll find that like, I'd say 80-90% of the time, they're probably not going to be successful.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I love the way you have been thinking about joining the company in the first place. It's really trying to understand and talking through and trying to understand really if there is an actual partnerships war and actually what you will do in the next year and then the years come forward. I think it's really interesting how you also are recommending the companies to think through that, because I think it makes so much sense that also, especially companies going through that, figuring it out themselves and really then thinking through in the next 1 year, 2 years and beyond, what's this person going to do, right? Thinking from the impact that they can have. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And maybe now if we go back a bit behind and just partnerships and maybe look at growth from a broader perspective, because you have been generalist, you have done so many different things like starting from product growth and partnerships. I'd love to understand how you think of growth and marketing in general for horizontal build yourself type products, which essentially Stripe to an extent you can consider that type of product. Notion obviously is that type of product. And what are the biggest challenges you see in general around growth? Partnerships is one part, but yeah, generally if we think from a more growth perspective.
Yeah, I think my answer will vary depending on where you are in terms of like product market fit, right? So if you don't think you have product market fit, my answer will probably start with customers. And I think this is just like where I spent a lot of my time at Stripe, right? In terms of like what we valued and what we like doing. And I joined Notion post product market fit, so I can't really speak to that. But I would say for Stripe, it was very much like, what does the customer need? And I think you focus on like, here's what you're providing today, right? We're a payments API, right? It's pretty simple and straightforward. You have to use something. You're very unlikely to do this yourself. So often you're deciding between whether you use Stripe and something else that exists in the space. And so I think when you're doing an assessment with a customer, it's trying to understand like, what are the boxes that they need you to check and how can you check that? And how do you position yourself in a market to come across as unique compared to the existing players? And I think Stripe really saw that in a lot of ways, historically, the decision on what payments provider you would choose was made by a finance person. But in reality, it's a technical decision. You're making a technical integration. And there was this like rise and shift in developers being able to make decisions around payments. So if we say, hey, we're not finance people, we're not going to be good at selling to finance people for a long time, like long time. And so let's think about what are the things that we can build to uniquely serve this underserved market. And so the idea being that really great developer documentation was something that like didn't exist. You would have to like download PDFs of like API documentation, just truly terrible. A lot of the like pre-written code, libraries, right? Just a lot of the things that we think maybe now is like basics of getting a developer product right, were something that were out of the box for Stripe. And then at the same time, we were really aggressive about asking people for feedback and delivering on that feedback over time. So I think that made us very much a company that was that a lot of other developers looked up to. Actually, I went back and I took a whole, I did an entire inventory of all the things that I think that Stripe did in the very early days to like kind of drive product market fit and customer growth in the early days. And it was very different than I think what Notion did. And I think it was just very different types of products. And on the Stripe side, it was a lot of customer love efforts and a lot of getting your customers to talk about you instead of you talking about you. So what I mean by that is like, you have a customer who hits certain threshold, like they processed $100,000 in payment processing volume. You send them a handwritten card signed by the team and like some cupcakes to like, congratulate them on this milestone. Right. And that generates a lot of like love for the company because this, like vendor reached out to you and did a nice thing for you. And when we would have betas of products, right, we would have a certain segment of users beta test a product before we released it. And on the day of our beta or our GA launch, when we would ship it out to everybody else, we would send all of our beta customers a handwritten note and some kind of like sweet or thank you. And then we would send them an email that same day saying, hey, like, we just launched this product today and it's, kind of like halfway up Hacker News or something like that. If you wouldn't mind like making a comment and like just sharing your story about using the product, that would be really helpful. Right. And so instead of a bunch of, Stripe people talking about the product, it was just a bunch of our users talking about how much they love the product. And, it seemed organic, but it wasn't really organic. We were behind the scenes trying to get people to do this. And I think for developer products, that's critically important, that it's not the company just constantly talking. It's a community that you're building around the product, talking about your product. And it's, I think, the job of the company to actually amplify those voices more than you amplify the voices of people who work for the company. So there were a lot of initiatives like that we did in the early days. Things like, oh, let's host a hackathon because we think it'll be fun and get people to come to our office and, feel some affinity towards Stripe. We had this like capture the flag competition that we built, I think, for 2 years in a row. And ended up like netting like 10 engineering hires as well. Right. So like pretty significant, recruiting brand and product brand building efforts that I think were really critical in Stripe becoming a developer brand. I think with Notion, a lot of the tactics were actually quite similar, but just oriented towards a non-developer community, right? So let's start this Notion ambassadors community. Okay, great. Like a lot of these ambassadors are building this content for free. What if we have them build content that like we actually want to see out in the world and we like help support them in their efforts of building that. And we like provide some funds to be able to produce like a highly productionized, like video. Great. Fantastic. So then we're supporting this community, financially as well. And now you have some of these people going off and making, over $1 million a year with like Notion courses, Notion templates, Notion videos. So I think you're trying to figure out like, what is the motivation of this community? Why are they doing this? What intrigues them? And then how do you amplify their voices so that, again, it's not you talking about your product, it's this community talking about your product. So I think very, very similar things from like a virality and like word of mouth concept. And then eventually like, that post product market fit, like that may not work as long, right? Like, like what worked in the early days of this like community stuff. I think you start to have to look at it very differently. So post product market fit, when I was at Notion,
would you not say it actually keeps then scaling on its own if you have set the kind of baseline right, and then you have really engaged community, and you really have helped them grow where they are, then it will also, you can kind of set the structures in place for them to help to scale on their own.
Yeah, I do think it can continue to grow on its own, but I do find that you do need resources to like mold and shape, because sometimes like communities can, maybe sometimes go in a negative direction or get out of control if like someone in the community doesn't feel like they're getting the right treatment or doesn't feel like they're getting what they wanted out of the community, right? So we ended up hiring like a full-time community manager at Notion just to do this. And it used to be just like this side project of marketing, right? So eventually thinking that like you need someone who can be fully immersed in that community, who is, part of the company ultimately, I think was clear. But I do think it does scale. I don't think it like stops working. I think at a certain point, it's just like when you're going from, 1 to 10 million in a year, it's a huge feat, right? But then when you start thinking about the level of growth that you have to do to go from 10 to 100, like that you need more tactics than just community, because it's not scaling in the same way that you need to scale the overall business.
Right.
And so then when you start thinking about the overall business, post product market fit, how do you scale growth? I always like to think about it as like, again, like putting myself in the shoes of the customer and thinking about, okay, we've worked really well with this, like, in the case of Notion, like this tool maker, kind of like craftsman type of person who really likes to like optimize all of their workflows and all that kind of stuff. But sometimes like you're going to start working with like larger customers, and then you're going to hit someone in like the legal function or something like that. Someone who's like, I don't know what this software is. I just want to use Google Docs. Like, how do I just write a document? How do I get to a database view? Like, how do I edit this? And, it's a customer coming in with a different mindset. They're being forced to use this product by their organization, and they need to like learn and come up to speed. And so I think your mindset goes from like, hey, we're building this like fun, interesting, multifaceted product to like, oh, we need like tutorials. We need better onboarding. We need, the ability to like easily manage and control your workspace, because, you're growing as an organization and you don't want everybody to see everything. Right. So a lot of those kinds of things start coming up as really critical features for what you need. And I like to just like take a step back, put my like, general counsel hat on, or like, whatever it might be, and like go through the product experience as if I am this person. And like, what would be difficult to me when I take a step back from like the Notion experience that I know and love. And there's a lot, that can be fixed, that can be optimized for someone who's just coming in with a very different mindset. And that's the mindset that you need to grow to. Just like Stripe had to grow from like developers to non-technical businesses, and start to make its product like more friendly to finance people, more friendly to like non-technical product people, right? So I think in a lot of ways you need to both like quickly change the product to be suitable to more types of users. And then also have a forum within a company that's like specifically targeted at the kind of growth that you need to hit every month to achieve your goals. So if you need to hit, 7%, 8% month over month growth, I think that's a really critical thing that everybody in your company needs to know, and marketing needs to be aligned, product needs to be aligned, and you need to be looking at those numbers like every day to understand like, are we on track or are we off track? And that's a very different mindset from like build the community and they will come, right? So some of those things will work and then they'll scale, but like eventually you need to kind of work your way out of that mindset and start thinking about it in a different way when you're trying to target like 3x growth in a given year and you have really big numbers to hit. So
yeah, thank you for sharing that. But I guess in the at the core of everything still lies the product, right? Because if people are not really, they are not passionate about the product, all of that is again not going to work. So I think first there is all of these different components that have to really be worked out and be in place, like really good product, understanding and supporting customers, and then of course the community kind of starts evolving, and then you really help them grow and scale beyond what they just can do. So one thing that I also wanted to just dive in before we finish off, and this has been really interesting conversation. But one thing that we also have done recently was upon joining the first round capital, you wrote an article which was called 23 Tactical Company Building Lessons Learned from Scaling Stripe and Notion. And there's some of these points that you mentioned, and some were really, really interesting, which I would love to just dive in and hear your kind of thoughts and share your experience for especially those who haven't read the article. There was one which was really interesting about challenging yourself to get more technical, which not coming from a technical background and really being like getting into Stripe, which is a very technical product. I love how you have how you have really embodied yourself into all of the technical aspects and then went into and try to even understand, how technical APIs work, running SQL queries, etc. So what's your recommendation, especially for this, the no code, low code, and more customer build type products, which are still going to be more technical than a very vertical HR platform where the workflow is defined for you. Especially from an employee perspective, what do you recommend the employees to do in terms of really becoming proficient at what they do and really even adding value to the company by getting into the weeds and the details of the product itself, especially the product being more or less compared to other products, more technical?
Yeah. So when I joined Stripe, I ended up sitting next to our first employee who had a really interesting story. He was like a mechanical engineering, I want to say, degree undergrad. So like technical, but not like computer science per se, right? And joined Stripe and was doing a bunch of like kind of ops and like finance stuff. And then just was like, if I'm going to add value here, I'm just going to need to learn how to code, right? So became an engineer. And by the time that I was sitting next to him, he was, a full-fledged engineer at Stripe. And so, I think one thing that was really helpful for me was that, I kind of had this like sense of him that he was like, kind of part business person, in terms of like what he had done prior to Stripe. And then also, someone who was really talented as an engineer as well. And I think it made it feel to me a little bit more like doable. It didn't feel like this,
you had a good like, role model
thing.
Next to you.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And then, at a certain point in time, I would always just like, if I hit a question in terms of like the depth of the product that I feel like I was, not quite fully understanding, like I would ask him those questions, right? And I wouldn't be afraid of asking them. And at the same time, I think there's like both a combination of like, what is the actual knowledge that you have of like how the product works, how it operates, but then there's also the like, how do engineers talk about products and how do you use that same language? And I think Stripe was really great in the early days because it was a company that like really tweaked you on your language. Like I would say, I would use like the inappropriate phrase for like docs or like, something like that. And somebody would be like, oh, like that's not quite how you say it. Like, and like people weren't afraid of giving me feedback to like sound kind of more technically competent. And at the same time, when I didn't quite understand how a system would operate, they would get up with me at a whiteboard and talk about like, okay, I make this API call and that sends this information here. And then, et cetera, et cetera. And so like, then I became someone who was able to kind of mirror and copy that in a lot of ways. And then I would walk into rooms and, people would be like, what do you do here? Like, with like external parties, they're like, are you a product person? Are you an engineer? Are you a business person? I have no idea. So I loved to be like that kind of like somewhat confusing, like you don't know where this person sits, kind of person. And I think it's, asking questions internally. It's, really listening and trying to grok that feedback and like being thankful to the people who provide that feedback. As so much so that at a certain point, Stripe actually started doing like coding classes for people within the organization. So we just got like interested engineers and said, hey, like from like, 7 to 9 p.m. at night, every Tuesday, do you want to like teach a class on like how to learn JavaScript or something like that, right? And I think it really showed that like Stripe had this like kind of unique learning culture, and that people who were non-technical wanted to learn how to become technical, and that the best developer documentation was actually developer documentation that non-technical people could read and understand. And, you know, our test was like our own employees, right? Trying to like understand the documentation and how to convey it to technical and non-technical customers. So I think it's like, it's all about the organization in a lot of ways. It's not always about you as the individual, but like seeking out others in your organization who like are learners and teachers and, you know, willing to like help you in your journey. And I think you being open to like asking questions and not closing yourself off, like with the idea like, oh, they're going to find out that I'm like non-technical, right? Like, like that's it, don't worry, it's the assumption. So
don't worry, probably people already know when they heard
right,
you,
right? exactly. So so often it's like you have to prove that you're technical, even if you know had like an engineering degree, right? So in a lot of ways, I think it was really helpful for me to be at a place like that when I was, you know, at the early part of my career, because now I don't really hesitate in asking questions or feeling like I look dumb when having a technical discussion. And I find that like actually engineers far prefer people who ask questions over someone who is trying to feign confidence in a topic. So
yeah. And what's really interesting, the company was essentially the culture was embedded, and it was already that way, right? So it was very open and supporting, and even actually encouraging non-technical people within the organization to become kind of technical, because that's also what the company, the product requires to an extent. Yeah. This sounds all amazing. Thank you so much, Cristina. Amazing to hear all of the insights, and I learned so much. And I hope our listeners too. And where can people find you on the internet?
Oh, yes. Probably the easiest place is Twitter. My handle is @CJC.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Cristina, and I'm really glad to have you on board.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.